Welcome to Daily Dose Radio, a 5-minute devotional podcast studying the Psalms verse by verse. Broadcast from the ever-beautiful Sharonville, Ohio, on the sunny side of Cincinnati. Hey, welcome back to the Bible Bistro. Come on in here and sit down. We got some grand Bible study for you today. We're looking at verses 5 and 6 in Psalm 61. This is Daily Dose Radio, by the way. Your home for organic Bible study that's artisanal and fresh. Today we're in Psalm 61, verses 5 and 6. And I said last time that this section, after the Selah, we have the reverse, basically, of verses 1 through 4. This is a comparison. It's a mirror in a way. We're going to look at how that happens here in these verses. Some key words that are used that kind of point to this whole idea that we have a comparison that needs to be looked at closely because it's wonderful. David begins in verse 1 by saying, "Hear my cry, O God." All right, let's find out what he says there in verse 5 and 6. "For thou, O God, hast heard my vows. Thou hast given me the heritage of those that fear thy name. Thou wilt prolong the king's life, and his years as many generations." All right, so that's 5 and 6. He begins in verse 1 by saying, "Hear my cry, O God." In 5 he says, "O God, you have heard my vows." Now it's not a cry any longer, but it's a vow. So because the shelter has done its job, that is, the shelter from enemies, the shelter of worship, and the shelter of loving kindness, because all of that has had its effect, now David can say, after the Selah, we have a hard break with the Selah, "You've heard my vows." So it's no longer "hear my cry," it's "you've heard my vows. Thou hast given me the heritage of those that fear thy name." Verse 6, "Thou wilt prolong the king's life, and his years as many generations." Okay, so in verses 2 and 3, we had, "The end of the earth I will cry unto thee when my heart is overwhelmed. Lead me to the rock that is higher than I, for thou hast been a shelter for me, a strong tower from the enemy." And verse 6 says, "You've prolonged my life." So maybe now David is looking back after generations and saying to himself, you know what? That prayer I prayed, that thing I said, God's done that. He has prolonged my life. You've given me years, as many generations. So the Lord had blessed him. And you'll notice how it's opposite of what we had in the first verses there. We're going to find out more about that tomorrow as we look at 7 and 8, but we'll get to that then. Let's go back up to verse 5. "For thou, O God, hast heard my vows." There's another one of those key words here in the psalm. We had "for thou hast been a shelter" there in verse 3, and here it is again, "For thou, O God, hast heard my vows." So verses 1 and 3 come to us here in verse 5. "Thou, O God, hast heard my vows. Thou hast given me the heritage of those that fear thy name." So now we understand that while in verse 2 his heart was overwhelmed, and we all understand that, right? I mean, everybody who's listening to the sound of my voice gets that. We understand being overwhelmed. It's just too much to handle. Can't take it any longer. So overwhelmed we get. But then we have this. "You've given me the heritage of those that fear thy name." No longer overwhelmed, but because I'm not afraid of what might happen. Now, what I have is I have confidence because I fear the name of the Lord. And fearing the name of the Lord is the beginning of all things good for the life of the believer. Fearing the name of the Lord and respecting Him and calling on that name and living according to that name and all that He teaches us about that name. Ladies and gentlemen, that's the beginning of and the foundation of a holy walk with the Lord. So when David says here, "You've given me the heritage of those that fear thy name," I'm no longer overwhelmed in heart. Now I have something beautiful within me, something to hold on to. I'm not afraid. Now, I fear the Lord. Okay, so join me tomorrow. We're going to look at verses 7 and 8 on Daily Dose Radio. Thanks for listening to Daily Dose Radio. I'm David Smith. The music today has been performed by the Bluegrass Experiment. Thanks again for listening. I'll see you next time on Daily Dose Radio.